Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. I have a real treat for you today. I'm sitting down with historian Rachel Crastle, and we're talking about her new book, Bismarck's War. Now, as I'll say again when we get into the interview, I thought back onto, hey, what have I been taught about the Franco-Prussian War? And then I come back with a big almost nothing. It's just a stepping stone to World War I. It's just part of German unification, but it's so much more than that. This book does an excellent job of laying out the foundations for the war, the causes, the immediate sparks, what it was like to fight as a regular person, and in many ways, how it was a precursor to World War I. It also goes through the ineptitude of some of the French command, notably Napoleon III, who you will remember from our other book. We talked about the last emperor of Mexico. He couldn't conquer Mexico, and he can't stop Bismarck, Napoleon III. So it's a great book overall, an excellent read, and a terrific read for somebody who's interested in early modern European history. I couldn't find anything comparable when it came to the Franco-Prussian War that doesn't get ridiculously into the weeds in terms of troop movements and specific commanders' names and so on and so forth. This is a military history that stays broad enough that it is accessible to any fan of history, and I highly recommend picking it up. As I always say in every single author interview that we do, the link is in the show notes. If you'd like to check it out, it's out today. So feel free to click that link and purchase the book. I'm sure Rachel would love it, and I'm sure that you will be a happier history buff having read it. With that being said, here's the interview. Okay, welcome back. As I mentioned, I am sitting down here with historian Rachel Crastle, and we're talking about her most recent book, out today, entitled Bismarck's War. It's the Franco-Prussian War and the Making of Modern Europe. You know, it was kind of interesting as I sat down and read the book. I started to try to think back to all the European history courses that I had taken throughout college and even going back to AP European history in high school, and tried to think of, okay, what was I taught about the Franco-Prussian War? And the same answer kept coming up in that I wasn't really taught the war independently. And what I mean by that is the war was, I think, part of a chapter called German Unification. And it was taught as sort of an aspect of German unification, but it was never discussed of its own merit. And you kind of start in the book, in the introduction, talking about the realities in that the Franco-Prussian War is almost sort of consistently forgotten when we teach European history, and even when we teach modern European history. I was wondering if you could touch on that for a second and talk about, why is that? And also, why is it such a problem? Because I do agree with you. I think it is.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And I'm happy to be here. Glad to be able to talk about the book. I think the book is. I think that the war is forgotten for a couple of different reasons. First of all, as you mentioned, it gets lumped in with the wars of German unification. So those wars that happened between 1864 and 1871 that led to the unification of Germany in January of 1871. The Franco-Prussian War is the last of those three conflicts. But I think there's a bigger picture for why the Franco-Prussian War gets forgotten. And that's because it gets lost with the two world wars. It gets overshadowed by World War I and World War II, of course. And so people just kind of see this as just one more run-up to that conflict between France and Germany that happens in the 20th century. But I think that's a shame because the Franco-Prussian War is its own conflict. It's 44 years prior to World War I. It stands right in the middle between the Napoleonic Wars and the World Wars of the 20th century. And so in terms of technology, in terms of strategy, in terms of the ways that European armies were constructed and put together, it is right in the middle of those two kinds of conflicts. And we can dig into that a little bit down the road. But it's furthermore an interesting conflict because unlike, say, World War II, there's not a clear cut answer to sort of who's the hero and who's the villain in this war. There's not somebody that you're really rooting for to say, this is the good guy that we want to see win. It's much more a conflict between two nations that were trying to duke it out for supremacy on the continent, and they're very interesting. The leadership is very interesting, very, very different. Bismarck and King Wilhelm on the one hand, Napoleon III, and then later the government of national defense in France on the other hand. They're more complicated. They're more they're less easy to pin down. But it's a fascinating conflict, precisely because it's right in the middle of those two kinds of wars, and because of the ways that civilians get caught in the conflict. That becomes the harbinger for the great wars that come in the 20th century.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I do want to come back, and we are going to come back to sort of how this war functions as a stepping stone to World War I, because I think that there's really interesting, some interesting stuff to talk about there. But actually, sometimes when I'm teaching, I tell my students, I think World War II, World War II is kind of the exception in that we have, the clear good guys and the clear bad guys. Like, if you go back through most wars in history, depending upon what side you're on, that oftentimes dictates who you think the good guy and the bad guys are. There's not as often a clear-cut hero and villain like we get with the rise of the Nazi Party and, what all the things that sort of come with that. Like, we have this desire now, I think, as a result of World War II to sometimes retrospectively go back and sort of label who's the hero and who's the villain in some of these conflicts, when this is realpolitik, as we'll get into in a second. And it's not necessarily about good versus evil. This is a conflict between two nation states. But before we just sort of kick the German unification can off the screen, let's just touch on it for a second, because this war does play a really, really important part in German unification. And I was hoping you could kind of explain to the audience sort of where we are in German unification in that process when the war starts, and what Bismarck's theory is in terms of how this war is going to help to solidify the final unification of Germany, which, of course, in fact, it does.
Absolutely. So at this point, following the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, the North German Confederation has come into being, and Bismarck is the chancellor of that confederation. So Prussia is, of course, at the heart, the leadership of that confederation, but many, many, many German states and principalities have at this point joined that North German Confederation. And remaining independent, the three primary areas are Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg, and part of the Duchy of Hesse. So these areas are still independent, but they are now they now have treaties with the North German Confederation that require them to go to war should Prussia be attacked or be engaged in a conflict. Now, even so, once France and Prussia end up declaring war on each other in July, it's not entirely clear whether the South German states are going to fall into line. Bavaria in particular is very reluctant to join Prussia in this fight, even though their military has been dominated by Prussia for the last 3 years. Even though they're required by treaty, they're still considering, well, should we declare war or not? But ultimately, they came down to the realization that if they did not join on the side of Prussia and Prussia won, they would not be dealt with very kindly. Otherwise, by joining the conflict, Bavaria understood that they could negotiate for potentially better terms, as they could see the writing on the wall that they were going to be incorporated into a united German empire. But I think it's really important to note that this war for Bismarck was not a war of conquest. They weren't trying to create the German Empire by conquering these South German states. They were trying to incorporate them through treaty, through demonstration of power, through demonstration of a common conflict, so that inhabitants of all of these different areas, Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and so on, would see themselves on the side of victory. And you see this happening in print. I followed the story of a Bavarian soldier who 4 years ago was on the opposite side. And now he's marching off to war alongside Prussia and underneath the Crown Prince of Prussia. And from the very beginning, he starts to say, hey, I'm fighting alongside with these Prussians. And while there still is considerable cultural difference and sort of sense of difference between Bavarians and Prussians for sure happening in this conflict, they are also going into battle together. And the press tried valiantly to show that Germans were fighting together. And that sense of unity was what helped to lead to not only the actual political unification that happened in January as the result of Prussian victories and Prussia's negotiations with these other countries, but it also meant that individual Germans more were inclined to see themselves as German and to accept the fact of the empire once it was declared.
Yeah, and I want to come back a little bit later on to Bismarck and Bismarck's sort of war aims here to ask you a little bit later, do those sort of change at some point here in the process. But I think it is important to recognize that, yes, there are these parts of Germany who still sort of remain outside of the United Northern German portion, and they are very distinct. And are hesitant, as you do a great job of pointing out, even as the conflict is starting, there's this question mark, Bavaria does sort of recognize it has to get involved, but it's still it wants to sit, it wants to wait, if at all possible. And so there's a lot going on here, but let's talk about the conflict for a second in terms of there's obviously a spark to usually every conflict. And the war, it also, as I was taught it years and years ago, was also sort of a conflict where this is Bismarck just, running circles around Napoleon III. He has him totally duped. He's, we're talking about, a professional football team playing a high school football team here, sort of quality. He's just on another level, and Napoleon III is just an idiot, and he's just falling for it. He takes the bait, as it were. So is that true? And what starts this conflict going?
Well, it is. I mean, it's true to a certain extent, but like everything, there's always more complications. So absolutely. So the spark of this particular conflict was the candidacy for who would be on the throne in Spain, which sounds like such an early modern kind of a spark, right? France is worried about being encircled by Hohenzollerns. And so when Prussia proposes one of their family members to take the throne in Spain, France protests against that candidacy, and Prussia withdraws it. But when they do so, France kind of comes back with a stronger ask, saying, not only will you withdraw this candidacy, but we want you to promise you'll never propose this again. And of course, that's something that no sovereign state is going to do. They're not going to make promises about the future. And so when that happens, then there's a rebuff from the King of Prussia, which was sent in a telegram that Bismarck then doctored to sound even more harsh than it actually was. So it sounded like this conflict, this conversation that happened between the Prussian king and France's representatives came off as much, much harsher than it actually was. And by this time, France could not back down. They had put themselves in such a position around this candidacy that it was very tough for them to then back down and say, okay, we won't go to war. Let me back up a little bit and just mention that ever since Prussia defeated Austria in 1866, it was very clear that at some point France and Prussia were probably going to go to war because Prussia was demonstrating that it wanted to be the top dog on the continent, and France under Napoleon III, who had always had a lot of baggage because of his famous uncle, of course, the great Napoleon. He had never himself been such a very successful military commander. He had struggled in Mexico. He'd been embarrassed there. He'd been embarrassed when Poland tried to rise up against Russia. He had not been able to influence any of the outcome of the war between Prussia and Austria. So for years and years, he had been suffering black eyes. And so it was pretty clear that Prussia was going to want to show their dominance against France, and this was a good opportunity for it. So it's not like Bismarck was exactly looking for this conflict at exactly this time, but he had his options open and he was ready to move when he could. And then, as I said, he doctors this telegram so that France was backed into a corner. So there's the spark of it, and we can talk a little bit more about their leadership as the war unfolded as well.
Yeah, and listeners will remember that we did the book, The Last Emperor of Mexico, a couple of years ago that talked about that debacle of an attempted French invasion of Mexico, which takes place during the American Civil War, which Napoleon saw as sort of like the opening to maybe get in there while the United States was distracted. And as you'll recall, it doesn't work and it costs a lot of money. And so some of Napoleon III's decisions, as we'll see later on, are a little regrettable as we move forward. There's an interesting part. So as the war starts to unfold and as it becomes clear that France and I'm going to use Germany, even though it's a little anachronistic to do so, that there is going to be a state of war between them. Now the question begins to take shape of, okay, is this going to be France versus Germany, or are other European states going to become involved? And that struck me as I was reading the book to be a very important question, because, as you mentioned, Prussia and Austria had recently fought a conflict. And so perhaps it's in Austria's best interest to intervene, but only if there's a chance that France is going to prevail in this. If they're not going to prevail, then maybe there isn't a good opportunity. And then Britain's a little bit different too. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the alliances and lack thereof, and how important that is as this conflict gets started.
Sure. One of the challenges for France was that it did not have allies going into this war, and it was desperately seeking to find common cause with Austria, perhaps with Italy, looking a little bit to Britain, but with less hope there. They certainly hoped that they could do an offensive that would head due east into Baden as a first foray, and that success there might bring Austria in, or perhaps Italy as well. That didn't happen. It didn't happen before the war started, and it certainly didn't happen as the war began, and France had some immediate reversals. And then Britain was Britain actually, in a foreshadowing of 1914, was watching very keenly to what happened in Belgium. They wanted to make sure Belgium remained neutral, as it did in this particular case. So they weren't particularly eager to join in the conflict either. Russia was looking for a moment to take advantage of everyone else's distraction to try and renegotiate the terms around the Crimean War that had concluded about 13 years earlier. So nobody was particularly eager to join France. They didn't see them as particularly strong, although they were much stronger against Prussia than we might think, and I think we should unpack that a little bit. But nobody was willing to join in the fight. And by the time, even within the first week of fighting, as France starts to retreat back into itself, there was no way that the other countries were going to join on board. They were eager, however, as the war unfolded, to bring the conflict to an end. They did not want to see Prussia become too strong. So they were looking for ways to help bring the two parties to the table and negotiate. And they were very happy to see that happen finally in January of 1871.
Yeah, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of relative strength of France versus Prussia, because as I was reading the book, and paper strength, it can be misleading, but on paper, they looked pretty close to me. And this is a big conflict, by the way. Like, the number of troops that are involved here are huge. This isn't a small scale war by any stretch of the imagination. So I was hoping you could talk about that, like their strengths on paper, but then also thinking about French weaknesses. There are some sort of hidden weaknesses that you get into a little bit in the book, particularly when you start to think about support personnel and some of the things that maybe we don't think about oftentimes when we think about fighting a conflict. That, well, I mean, you need porters, you need people that carry things, you need horses, which I didn't have. You need like lots of auxiliaries who are non-combatants often to make sure that the army can get to where it needs to and can fight most effectively. And that, to me, struck me as one of France's biggest weaknesses going into this. I'm sorry it's a two-part question, but I'm confident we can get through it.
That's all right. I think so you mentioned the paper strength, and certainly this is a huge conflict. This is a conflict where There were armies measuring in the hundreds of thousands. The total mobilized on each side was in the 300,000 to 400,000. It evolved, of course, over time. France kept getting bigger and bigger. They kept fielding more men. But they were fielded in very different ways. So first of all, let's talk about the service model. In Prussia, they had universal conscription, which they were one of the first places to do that, and they had massive reserves of men who had been trained, who could be called up, and they had a system of calling up men so that they basically had a postcard that just needed to be dated and sent out to men to say, come show up on this date at this place. That was ready to go. Prussia also, by the way, pioneered the use of a dog tag during this conflict so they could keep track of their soldiers. On the French side, they were very much in the older model of having professional soldiers who served for a very long time. So they did have a lot of men that they could call up. Many of them were posted throughout the country. Some of them were posted in their colonies, so they were in Africa and needed to be shipped back onto the continent. They did not have the long they didn't have the conscript model that came later. Like most countries adopted the conscription model after the Franco-Prussian War. Instead, they did have the tradition, though, of the levée en masse that had dated back to the French Revolution, to the 1792. And so they did have this notion that if you did need to call people up, they would be called up and they'd be ready to go. There would be something about the French élan that would lead them to be able to go up and fight in battle. So there were actually quite a few volunteers over the course of the war, and after the fall of Napoleon, which we'll get to later, but as the war kind of dragged on, they were able to continually call up men. They just couldn't get trained in time to do anything significant in face of a well-trained reserve army that Prussia was able to field. So that's just talking about sheer battle strength. Let's talk about, you mentioned all the auxiliary personnel. So stretcher bearers, medics, horses, pharmacists, all the kind of supply, they just simply didn't have that organized in France. There were far, far more doctors ready to go who were attached to the Prussian army, ready to actually come into the field. So there's the personnel issue. French horses had been farmed out to farmers, and farmers weren't really eager to let the horses return to the army as the harvest was about to come in the summer of 1870. So that was a struggle. But more importantly was that France did not have a concept of the separation between mobilization on the one hand and concentration on the other hand. And that was an insight that Prussia had been able to actually mobilize and put into effect in 1870. And what do I mean by that? It means that you're not just sending soldiers and supplies and all the auxiliaries to the same location at the same time. Instead, you are making them mobile, you're getting them up and moving and going to the general area, but then you're concentrating them separately once they're actually there. France did not have this concept, and instead they were trying to get all the men to go to supply depots, pick up their weapons, and go straight to the location where they would be deployed. And it created just mass confusion as soldiers were crisscrossing the country, getting to their supply depot, and then trying to get to another location. It was slower than Prussia, and more importantly, it was demoralizing. So whereas Prussian soldiers and Bavarian soldiers are taking the train up to the frontier, and then maybe they're marching for dozens of miles to get to the right place of concentration, they were able to do that with relative ease and relative organization, and they got there relatively well rested and ready to fight. For the French, it was not quite the same. It was much more confused.
And then once the war actually starts to get underway, I think it's fair to say, France would have come into the conflict confident. Of course, they have this strong military tradition stretching back to Napoleon and beyond. And again, I think this is sometimes, especially in the United States, we get the post-World War II bias of a weak French military, but that simply isn't the case at all, and really isn't much of the case in that World War either. But the fact of the matter is they felt, I'd say they felt good coming into it. And man, does it unravel fast for them once the battles begin. as you mentioned, they're getting ready for this, what they think will be an aggressive invasion into German territory. And by the 6th of August, that mirage has all but evaporated. So I wonder if you could just kind of talk about those few early battles and about how quickly France's position goes from feeling confident to on your heels.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Adam, I really appreciate you framing that around the stereotype that we have of the French army, because of course they dominated during the Napoleonic Wars and needed 5 other countries to band together to defeat them. So there's a lot more complexity in all of those conflicts. And they were right to be confident. They had not only this large army that had been in the field for a long time, they had the superior rifle. They knew that, the chassepot, which could shoot from a mile away with remarkable accuracy, and really disturbed the German soldiers. Now the Germans had the superior cannon. They had the Krupp cannon that was bigger, heavier, more accurate. Their shells, the Prussian shells, could explode upon impact, so that was better than the timer fuses that the French had. But there was good reason to think the French would be strong. And indeed, in those first battles, the first battles on the meaningful ones on August 4th and then 2 on August 6th, they're all in the Lorraine and Alsace areas, right? France could have won those battles. They were close, especially the 2 on August 6th, one in Lorraine, one in Alsace. These were close battles. They were just a little bit outnumbered in one, and in both cases, there were crucial moments where if France had counterattacked, they might have prevailed. But instead, the Germans just sort of kept coming. It wasn't that the Germans fought perfectly. They certainly had their moments of disorganization when one of their generals, Steinmetz, kind of crosses in front of the army. One of their own armies, and it throws them off. But in the end, these 2 crucial battles just coincidentally happened to happen on August 6th. Neither of which were planned, by the way. Both of which they stumbled into each other and went from a small skirmish into a large-scale battle. France ended up having to fall back, and after August 6th, this is where we start to see Napoleon III's leadership really coming into play too. Napoleon III ordered the wing that was in Alsace of France, the wing under Mac-Mahon, to fall back. And then he kind of changed his mind and said, well, maybe we should actually stay in Metz. So what ended up happening is the French army split into 2. And part of the army circled all the way back from Alsace, all the way in the east, kind of swung to the south and around, and then halfway back to Paris. That's under Mac-Mahon. And then the other half, under Bazaine, ends up staying in the area around Metz. They no longer have contact with each other. And Napoleon III had gone back and forth about exactly what to do at that particular moment. That led them to be split. Mac-Mahon and Bazaine were not well communicating with each other. And so now you've got these 2 armies, both of which had felt like they should have won, but in fact retreated after August 6th. And they're not in communication, and Napoleon III is not sure what to do. So this is a crucial part for how France goes into a retreat mode that they never recover from.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. So there's a couple of things worth remembering here if you're listening to this. First of all, remember that we're in an age right now. This is similar to the American Civil War. We're only a few years removed from it. So the technology in terms of communication is roughly similar. It's in terms of knowing where units are, you're still very much dependent on messengers on horseback and people trying to get correspondence back and forth. And by the time you receive a message, unless that unit has stayed put, it might not be necessarily the same place anymore. So when we talk about armies sort of stumbling into each other, that happened all the time. It happened all the time in pre-modern warfare. You kind of knew where the other side was. You weren't totally sure about it. And, you start what turns into a skirmish. The Gettysburg started as kind of a skirmish, and ends up being the most important battle of the American Civil War. And which is just the easiest one for me to compare these battles to, which is why I tend to go back and forth. But The reality is, and this is the other crucial thing that really I took away from the book, and I really hope that listeners and people who read the book takes away from it too, is that this is the war itself is going to get remembered as this humiliating French defeat. But early on, it was a coin flip in a lot of these initial battles. The French very easily could have won. It is not as though they marched up and the Germans just blasted them off the line and they took off running. That's not what happened. These were close conflicts. They could have won some of those initial battles. And really, I mean, the question then comes to play, like, Napoleon III is kind of operating as the overall commander here, to the best of my knowledge. Kaiser Wilhelm does not engage in the same playing with toys scenario, those toy soldiers on the map, and he's not doing that. I mean, how much blame should we put on Napoleon III for sort of the ultimate outcome and the way that everything's going to go here? Because I'm not the sort of person, I don't ascribe to the great man theory of history very much, and I don't like to do that, but in reading the pages, it seems inescapable that he does deserve a significant amount of blame for this.
Agreed. And it was not only because of what happened in the battle. It's not just, what happened right after August 6th, as I was mentioning. It's years of not setting up his army for success, of not necessarily promoting the most qualified individuals into leadership roles, but rather having a little bit of cronyism in terms of promotion. He also bears blame in terms of, just as mobilization was happening, for changing how his armies were going to be organized, so that suddenly there was different chains of command that had to come together very, very quickly, and so it wasn't always clear who was going to listen to whom. Even as this retreat is happening, as I was describing, he was trying to give more authority to Bazaine, but even there, he was clearly meddling, and Bazaine didn't know whether he could actually make decisions or not. So, leadership matters, and in this case, it proved to be quite decisive. But on the other hand, there were also moments where France just didn't have the luck on their side. If there had just been sort of different responses in terms of who was available to those battles that weren't really planned in early August, maybe the tide would have changed in a different direction. But I do think that in this particular case, in terms of the fact of French defeat, Napoleon III was decisive.
Yeah, and I do think we have to remember, and you pointed it out earlier, that you have to imagine him with just this huge yoke around his neck all the time walking, because, he is related to the great Napoleon, who marched armies across all of Europe. And it sometimes seems to me that, Napoleon, whether it's the Franco-Prussian War or it's, the boondoggle into Mexico, is just trying to find ways to recapture some of that old spirit, but it's not part of a big concerted strategy. It's just kind of like, well, here's this opportunity, we'll do this, and here's this going on, we'll do that, but he also, when we get back to the doctored telegram and all that from the beginning from Bismarck, he has this real thin pride because of who he is, and he cannot suffer any sort of humiliation to that sort of respect, and so he gets really indecisive at times. And you could read biographies about this guy. He's an interesting guy, but he definitely has some major weaknesses. So now I want to go forward and talk about two key battles that take place on August 16th and 18th. And I never took French growing up, and so I'm going to pronounce them as Raisonville and maybe Gravelotte. I might not be close on those, but I'm sure you'll correct me. And you write that they rank, or should rank, among some of the most decisive and important battles in European history, and they're also extremely close. Again, this is not a 27-0 German blowout. This is a very close situation. So I was hoping you could talk about those battles. How close were they, and why are they so important?
Sure. These are both battles that took place on the outskirts of Metz. in August of 1870. And these were, on the French side, it was the Bazain's army who was engaged in this. Macmahon is already further west and not involved in them at all. So the battle that's known as Crescenville or Mars-la-Tour, it's named variously by the villages that were on the road heading out to Verdun. It happens on August 16th, and then the Battle of Gravelotte on August 18th, 1870. These were large-scale battles. Again, the first one was not particularly planned. It was one kind of a run to the guns kind of a moment, and again it was more on the strength of a lower level German commander who had run into some French and decided to actually engage in battle, and then the others kind of reluctantly got involved. The battle on August 18th was more planned. It was the first major engagement that was intended to happen on that day, and it happened in a variety of different locations. There were three major areas, north, central, and south, at the Battle of Gravelotte. And there were moments where it seemed, because of different ravines and the ways that the Prussians were trying to attack and were being repelled by those French rifles, the chassepot, it seemed like the Prussians might lose that battle. It was only because of some late arrivals toward the end of the day that the Prussians were able to prevail, and the fact that the French under Bazaine were not ready to counterattack when they might have done so. Certainly, it's easy to be an armchair general and say, "Oh, he should have counterattacked at 4 p.m. and then maybe they would have made it." And that's tough to say. It's clear though, Bazaine as a commander, and by the way, the Napoleon III was nowhere near these battles. He had already retreated further west to join Macmahon. But during these battles, Bazaine, who had just been promoted into this position of overseeing several armies together, he was a really great company commander. He had physical courage, but he was not able to see the big picture and to try and shape where the army was going. And many of his soldiers thought they won that battle, but then at the end of the day, the next morning he says, "Nope, we've got to retreat back to Metz." And so that was again a moment of demoralization, because depending on what sector you were in, you might have thought that you won that battle, but instead they're retreating back into the city, where they ended up being stuck for over 2 months under siege. So that was a crucial turning point where now half the French army is stuck, the other half is further west, and they're about to be caught in the Battle of Sedan.
Yeah, and so now we have the French army is effectively split, and so, which is not in a situation that you ever want to be in terms of a military situation. And that takes us to sort of the Battle of Sedan and the capture and surrender of Napoleon III. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that battle and how Napoleon winds up being forced, I suppose, to surrender at the end. And then I want to ask a sort of a follow-up question to that, which is, why doesn't the war just end? Why doesn't the war just end there? It seems like the war should be over, with the surrender of that army and with the surrender of someone who is ostensibly the head of the government, who is now captured by the other side. It seems like that should be the end of the track, but for whatever reason, it's not. So I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about the battle and why this isn't just the penultimate moment.
Sure. And so let's go back to mid-August. It's August 16th. Back, over in the east, Bazaine is fighting at the Battle of Crescenville, but they're not aware of this. Napoleon and Macmahon, they have fallen back now to Chalon, and they are deciding what to do. So Chalon is right in between Paris and Metz. So it's in the northern part of France. It's toward the east, but not all that far east. And so they're kind of restaging, debating what to do. They think, well, if we go back to Paris, that might be a good move, but maybe that would then draw us too far away and we'd basically be retreating. If we don't defend Paris, then we're leaving Paris to be potentially captured. So the position of Paris is a crucial part of the debate. If Napoleon goes back to Paris, then he's basically seen as abandoning the army. But if he doesn't, then he's opening himself up to being captured. So there was a lot of debate about what they should do. Eventually, they do strike out. They're looking for, they leave Chalon, And they kind of go back, they zigzag across the countryside looking for supplies, trying to figure out where the German armies are at this point, because as you mentioned, it's hard to know where the armies are. Meanwhile, the German armies are thinking, where are they going? We don't understand what's going on here. So for days, there's a lot of confused back and forth as they're just trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, and I think this is, if you know anything about French geography, right, the early battles are in Alsace and Lorraine. This crucial battle at Sedan is way up against the Belgian border. It's nowhere near those early battles. How did they get there? Well, basically they're looking for supplies, and then as German armies are heading west and north, they basically force France, they force Mac-Mahon with Napoleon III in train up into a corner. As they get closer to Belgium, they start to realize we can't cross into Belgium. If we do that, then suddenly, we risk total catastrophe. We're bringing the war into a neutral country. Britain might decide to intervene at that stage. Like, that would be a disaster. So they end up after some other skirmishes and trying to break out toward the east, maybe thinking they might connect with Bazaine, but they don't really know what's going on with him. They end up around Sedan. Now, Sedan is a fortress city, but it's basically a demoted fortress city. It's in a floodplain. There's the river. There's very marshy areas to the south. And much of the French army ends up being kind of within this fortress and in the immediate environs. Well, the German armies have by now kind of split into two branches, and they are encircling the entirety of this fortress area. Not that the Germans really know that that's happening. The rank and file soldiers, they start marching, some of them more going up north around the east side, some going up north around the west side. As they march, they suddenly realize, wait, we're hearing some noises. Oh, it's the other side of our army. We're starting to connect. We're encircling them. Okay, over the course of late August, all the armies are kind of encircling around Sedan. The Prussians have brought their cannon. They have set up literally hundreds of cannon to the south, and then eventually up around to the east and the west that then connect. And on the morning of September 1st, the Bavarians over in the southeast triangle start the conflict in a suburb called Bazaine, which ends up getting the very brunt of a very vicious battle. And the Prussian armies have encircled the rest of Sedan. And as the day went on, the French increasingly were backed up against each other. They were backed into corners. They were getting shot at from multiple sides. The Prussian cannon were able to continually target for hours and hours on end, just making it, being in, say, like a copse in the woods, you're just a sitting duck for the for the Prussian artillery. By the end of the day, Napoleon III realizes he needs to surrender. He is indeed inside the fortress of Sedan, which the Germans were not aware of. They were surprised to learn that he had put himself in that position, but there he was. The French have to, they decide to surrender, and the next day, as negotiations happen, Napoleon III ends up meeting first with Bismarck, where he's kind of reprimanded for being such an idiot, basically, and then he meets with the king, with Wilhelm, and Bismarck asks, "Are you surrendering yourself? Are you surrendering the army, or are you surrendering altogether?" And he says he's just surrendering himself and his army. He's not surrendering for France altogether. I think he thinks Bazaine might break out. Again, he's not fully aware of what's happened to Bazaine at this point, that he's trapped in Metz. And he thinks France just might have some kind of a chance to rescue itself from this terrible outing. He's still in political power, and he's allowed to escape on his own reconnaissance, and he ends up later going to England. But just a couple of days later, in Paris, once the news of this disaster has reached them on the night of September the 3rd, the very next morning, September 4th, there's an uprising in Paris, a very peaceful uprising, in which they declare themselves now a republic, a new republic, and the leadership of that republic, which are basically moderate Democrats, small d Democrats in France, Parisian-based, they decide we have got to fight on. There's no way that we're going to allow France to be dismembered, with this army right in the middle of us. And even though basically the entirety of the French army that had started in late July was either captured at Sedan, 80,000 prisoners of war taken in that single day, or they were bottled up in Metz with Bazaine. The French leadership nevertheless said, we've got to fight on. And they did fight on. They fought for another 4.5 months before finally accepting defeat.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of things here that, first of all, so you sort of have this double envelopment problem. You've got half the army in Metz, which is now surrounded, which, Napoleon doesn't know. Sure. Then you've got the other half in Sedan, also surrendered. So you lose all of your effective fighting force. Now, France is a very populous country. They have this long-standing tradition going back to the revolution of the levée en masse, that we'll just call up more people. This never-ending sort of a theory. So there's this idea that they're going to be able to fight on. That's one takeaway. The other takeaway I have from this is I was trying to go back and look at the history books to see. Okay, Napoleon III is captured, and he's the head of state at the time that he's captured. I'm pretty sure this is the last time in history that we have a head of state who's maybe dumb enough to be with the army. I mean, sure, Tsar Nicholas goes to the front in, quotation marks during World War I, but he's never dumb enough to be like up at the front with the army, and that also just never really works out that well. I mean, Bismarck might be thinking, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to get all this stuff. And like capturing the head of state, it turns out if you go back, it doesn't actually get you that much. I mean, even Charles V captures Francis I in the 16th century. He doesn't get anything from it. He gets a lot of empty promises, but he doesn't just like own France as a result, because people be like, no, we don't care. So I think that's interesting, but I am curious from Bismarck's point of view, and I love the part of the book, by the way, where he just kind of like belittles Napoleon III for being, an idiot. Like, what were you doing? Like, this is your fault, like, that we're all here. And like, why should we be nice to you? Sort of a thing. Like, you lost the game. Like, get over it. Are his war aims still the same at this point? Or does he now shift into, okay, half the French army has surrendered, the other half is effectively about to be surrounded in Metz. Paris is seemingly wide open. Like, I might be able to get a lot more out of this than I originally thought.
He does start working much more explicitly to capture part of France at this point, right? I mean, it's always been in the back of his mind, and certainly some people have been talking about capturing Alsace and part of Lorraine, parts that had been part of German states up until the 1680s during the reign of Louis XIV. They were captured and integrated into France. So almost 200 years of being owned by France, and previously had gone back and forth in all kinds of different ways. So it becomes much more explicit that Bismarck is seeking to gain these territories and incorporate them into the German Empire. And of course, that is what happens. But at this stage, the French are absolutely opposed to this. They see these territories as very much French, and have been for a very long time. Many of the population is very mixed in terms of speaking French, speaking German, having Protestant allegiances, Catholic allegiances, and in no way, by the way, does the language or the religion necessarily lead to where your heart lies in terms of where you see yourself as more French or more German. A lot of people saw themselves as Alsatian, and so it's a very complicated area in that regard. But nevertheless, Bismarck does start being more explicit about that. He's not interested in taking over all of France. That's a very different World War II kind of an aim. He's not interested in dismembering France. He doesn't want to, he wants to become the dominant power in Europe, but he also recognizes that he cannot upset the balance of power too much, or else the rest of the European countries will gang up against him. So he's savvy about that. But certainly at this moment in September, he starts to think, okay, we can probably take some more territory.
Yeah, and I think he's realistic and he's sort of objective in the way that he does things. And, he does recognize that there needs to be a balance of power in Europe, because if you do upset it too far, I mean, yes, maybe you've defeated France, but there's still Russia. There's still Great Britain. There's still Italy. There's still plenty of other states that could gang up on you. Austria's still over there, that could potentially throw their hat in the ring. Now, the siege of Paris is months long. It's horrific in many ways, shapes, or form. But I want to make sure we get time to get to the end of the war, because I think there's some interesting things to talk about there before we run out of time. But one thing that I was curious about was just, and you do a great job in the book talking about the impact on civilians, and both in Paris and in the countryside and so on and so forth. So that's a huge part of the book, and I don't want to mislead people that it isn't. So just acknowledge for a moment, if you're listening, that I'm just kind of punting. I'm going forward a little bit, okay? I was curious when I was reading the book, like, Paris is big. Paris is a really big city. And for the German army, no matter how large it is, until Metz surrenders, they still have to keep Metz under lock and key as well. So how is it that the Parisians, the French, aren't able to break out at any point? I mean, it seems like they have the numbers, but they're just not able to do it.
Well, they have the numbers, but again, they're not a very trained army. So it is indeed it's a military achievement in itself that the Prussian and the German armies are able to entirely encircle Paris, which is a massive undertaking. And they finally kind of meet on September 19th, and Paris is then under siege until the end of the war in January. So it's a long, cold winter of siege. Paris has mobilized a National Guard. National Guard units, which had been created back during the Revolution of 1848, sort of a sense of citizen guards, but they weren't very well trained. In fact, they would go home at night. Many of them would go back to their actual, civilian places of residence, and so they were minimally trained. They were certainly not particularly well able to undertake a fight out to break through a professional army. And not only that, but Paris itself was starting to become politically very much very divided, and divided very much on the left. So of course, once Napoleon III is overthrown, most Parisians were not a big fan of Napoleon III, and hadn't been for decades. I mean, keep in mind, this is a man who had been elected president in 1848, but then had dismantled the Republic within a few years. So he basically became an authoritarian leader, and was not popular among those who still harbored, desires for a revolutionary future. But then there's those who want a moderate republic and those who want something more radical. And in the 19th century, there's all different radical ideas. So Parisian neighborhoods were starting to have serious tension against each other, and that didn't help the cause of the government of national defense, which was a far more moderate kind of a government.
Now, I want to sort of turn to the end of the war, but one of the things that I was struck by when I got to this portion of the book was that for a conflict that's often forgotten, the losses are by no means insignificant at all. I mean, you list in the book 136,000 French soldiers killed in action, declared missing, or died of wounds. At Metz alone, we're talking about 35,000 people dying of dysentery or typhus. These are, German losses, 117,000 casualties. These are big numbers. We're not talking about a few hundred people on either side here, but clearly Germany wins the war. So in a short-term perspective, what does that mean? What do they get?
Sure. At that point, so they, during the course of the fall and the winter, as I mentioned before, Bismarck has been negotiating with the South German states. They played off of each other, played against each other to get terms to agree to declare a German empire, which they do in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in January of 1871. A very cold day, not a warm ceremony, but it's a unified Germany. They get the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. They get a 5 billion franc indemnity from France, which was actually quite in keeping with what had happened before, and actually also what happened at the Treaty of Versailles in after World War I. It was a similar scale, actually, but France managed to pay that off within a few years. They took out a lot of loans. They bounced back from the war financially. But as you mentioned, there was large numbers of casualties. If you compare almost 140,000 French soldiers who died in that conflict compared to the 1.4 French soldiers who died during World War I in a much longer conflict, the Franco-Prussian War was only 6 months long. It was an absolutely devastating conflict, and this was one where on both sides, memorialization of those who died, particularly soldiers, but a little bit civilians as well in certain cases. You start to see monuments, you start to see names being chanted, you start to see anniversary events happening after this war in a way that, like during the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers died where they were buried where they fell and they were not brought back home. You start to see that happening after the Franco-Prussian War.
So then, in thinking more like long term then, and this is going to be our last question because we're running out of time, but I'm just curious about sort of two things. Like what did these countries or these generals sort of learn from this conflict in a way that it would, sort of change their thinking going into World War I? And then, ultimately, and this is a tough question to answer, but is there any way in which sort of the Franco-Prussian War is sort of a prelude to World War I in that it sort of makes World War I a more sort of likely historical event?
It makes it more possible and imaginable. I don't want to draw too direct a line between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I. Sometimes people want to say, oh, France just wanted revenge against Germany, and that's what led to World War I. That's far too simplistic. It was 44 years later. A lot of things had changed. Most people were not looking for war for that reason. But where I really see the connections. One is, as I mentioned, the change in conscription models. So you have these massive national-based armies. And in the Franco-Prussian War, you start to see both on the French side and the German side, people talking about this war as a conflict between nations. Even though it had started as this really kind of old-fashioned dynastic conflict, it becomes a war between nations, and that's a harbinger for the 20th century. But I would also suggest that the way that civilians were incorporated in this war, you start to see some connections between the Franco-Prussian War and the World Wars. First of all, that the French tried to expel or at least move out of Paris Germans because they saw them as national enemies. That's a new treatment of civilians. You also see that civilians are finding themselves having to deal with, without any real preparation, they're dealing with the invading armies and really don't know what to do. The Prussians have no quarter for anybody who's a sniper or any civilian who tries to raise arms against them. Whereas the French have this tradition of guerrilla warfare, of fighting against an invading army, and they find themselves very much the targets of Prussian vengeance when that happens. So while we don't see anything near what happens to civilians in World War I and certainly not World War II, you do start to see the sort of like the horrors of what happens to civilians that get drawn into war start to be more serious, less, even less recompense when those things happen.
Yeah, and you can start to see how if you do, because it's only a 6-month war, and so you can start to see like, well, if the time period was expanded out, the sort of trauma that individuals would have to suffer through is exponential at that point. And I do think that that's one of the key sort of decisive changes that we got going forward. Well, we're out of time here, but I mean, was there anything else that I desperately missed that we needed to touch on?
No, this has been a great interview, Adam. It's been a real pleasure to talk with somebody who really knows and understands all these great issues. I really appreciate the conversation.
Oh, yeah, it's been great. And I hope people pick up a copy of the book. It's very well done. And also, I just hope that people start to collectively recognize the importance of this conflict going forward.